a bustling city filled with luxury and glitter, Emily was born to parents who seemingly had it all. Victoria and Robert, both successful and admired by their peers, eagerly awaited the arrival of their first child. They envisioned a perfect, healthy baby who would carry on their legacy. But when Emily was born, reality shattered their dream. Her tiny face, though innocent, was marred with scars that no one expected. Her fingers and toes, slightly deformed, didn't fit the picture of perfection they had imagined. The room fell eerily silent as doctors and nurses tried to reassure the new parents. "She's perfectly healthy, just looks a little different," they said. But for Victoria and Robert, those words didn't ease their shock or disappointment. Their baby, the child they had dreamed of, was not the image of beauty they had hoped for. Victoria stared at her newborn with a conflicted heart. "Is she okay?" she whispered, voice trembling. Robert, unable to hide his unease, shifted nervously in his chair. They looked at each other, their faces filled with worry and regret, as they both silently questioned if they were ready to be the parents of a child who didn't fit the mold of perfection. As the days passed, the weight of their decision grew heavier. Every time they looked at Emily, the disappointment in their eyes deepened. This wasn't the life they had envisioned. They couldn't imagine introducing her to their social circle or showcasing her on social media for the world to see. The child they thought they would show off proudly was now a burden they didn't know how to bear. 1 week after Emily's birth, they made an agonizing decision, a decision that would change the course of her life forever. In the middle of the night, they packed up their baby and drove to the front gates of the Hope orphanage, leaving her with a note that read, "We can't take care of her, please find her a good home." With that, they drove away, leaving their daughter behind, unaware that this little girl who they thought was too imperfect to love would one day rise above it all. Are you ready to see how this heartbreaking story unfolds? Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on Emily's incredible journey. The best is yet to come. The days after Emily's birth felt like an eternity for Victoria and Robert. What should have been a time of joy, love, and bonding was instead clouded by feelings of guilt, confusion, and sorrow. Each time they looked at their newborn, their minds were filled with doubt. They had spent months preparing for this moment, decorating her room with soft pastel colors, buying cute little clothes, and daydreaming about the perfect family they would have. But now, looking at Emily, those dreams seemed shattered. Robert tried to push the uncomfortable thoughts aside. He kept telling himself that everything would be okay, that they would adjust to the idea of raising a child who wasn't quite what they expected. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He couldn't imagine walking through the neighborhood with a daughter who didn't fit in, who would be the subject of whispers and stares from others. Would people judge them for having a child who didn't look like the picture-perfect baby everyone expected? Victoria, on the other hand, couldn't ignore the sense of dread growing inside her every time she picked Emily up in her arms. The weight of responsibility seemed unbearable. She loved her daughter, yes, but she was scared. She was scared of what others would think. What would her friends, colleagues, and family say when they saw her baby? Would they understand? Would they even care? And, perhaps most importantly, would Emily ever be happy with parents who couldn't even accept her for who she was? Days turned into a week, and the guilt and tension only grew. Victoria and Robert didn't know how to move forward. They couldn't even look at their baby without feeling a mix of confusion, regret, and fear. The simple act of feeding Emily felt like a monumental task. As she slept, they whispered to each other, questioning their ability to raise her. "What if we can't do this?" Victoria whispered one night, the words thick with emotion. "What if we're not enough for her?" Robert remained silent, staring at his daughter's tiny face. He couldn't bear to say it out loud, but he knew they were both thinking the same thing. They couldn't give Emily the life they had imagined. The pressure was too great. They both realized that, deep down, they couldn't imagine a future with her. On the third night, after yet another sleepless evening, Robert made the decision. He said little to Victoria as they packed up the baby's things, collected Emily into her car seat, and prepared to leave the house. They didn't speak much during the drive. The silence between them was suffocating. The tension was palpable. Both knew that what they were doing was wrong, but they didn't know how else to escape the overwhelming sense of failure that loomed over them. They arrived at the gates of the Hope Orphanage just as the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the quiet building. The world outside seemed still. Frozen in time, Robert parked the car, and for a moment, neither of them moved. They both stared at Emily, sleeping peacefully in her carrier. It was hard to reconcile the beautiful, innocent face before them with the decision they had made. Victoria took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "We can't do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she spoke, she knew there was no turning back. They had made their choice. Robert got out of the car first, then walked to the back and carefully lifted Emily from the seat. Victoria followed behind, her eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. They walked up to the gates of the orphanage, the weight of their decision pressing down on them like an anchor. As they reached the door, Robert pulled out a small envelope from his jacket pocket. It was the note they had written earlier, a note that contained everything they couldn't bring themselves to say to Emily directly. He placed it on the ground next to the baby, then turned to Victoria. With one final look at their daughter, who had no idea what was happening, they turned and walked away. The door to the orphanage creaked open, and they slipped out of sight, leaving behind the life they had imagined and the child they could not accept. Inside the orphanage, the night was quiet. The caretaker, Sarah, was making her rounds when she heard the sound of something at the door. A small figure appeared in the shadows, a tiny baby carrier sitting beside the entrance. Sarah's heart sank. She immediately rushed forward, kneeling beside the baby, and noticed the envelope with the brief, heartbreaking note. "We can't take care of her. Please find her a good home." As Sarah picked up Emily, she felt an overwhelming sense of compassion. She promised herself that Emily would never feel abandoned again. She would be loved, cherished, and raised in a place where her uniqueness would be seen as her strength, not a weakness. The first few days at the Hope Orphanage felt like a blur. Emily was just another face in a sea of abandoned children, many of whom were older and already resigned to their fate. The orphanage was not a place of warmth and safety. It was a place of survival. The walls were old and cold, and the echoes of footsteps in the hallways were the only sound that filled the silence. The caretakers were kind, but stretched thin. They had their own lives, their own struggles, and could only provide the bare minimum for the children in their care. Emily's arrival was no different from any other. She was just another baby to be fed, changed, and put to sleep. No one expected her to be anything more. To the other children, Emily was just another face to be ignored or, worse, teased. She was different from the others. While the other babies had perfect, round faces, soft hair, and little hands that looked like they belonged to a doll, Emily had scars on her face and hands that didn't look quite right. The children quickly noticed her difference, and as much as they were told not to, they couldn't help but laugh or point fingers. Lumpy, they called her. Squashy, they taunted. Emily tried to ignore them, but it wasn't easy. She was a baby, and her heart was just as fragile as her body. Every time someone laughed at her, she felt a sharp pain, like a tiny crack forming in her heart. It was something she couldn't yet understand, but felt deeply nonetheless. But as Emily grew older, something began to change inside her. At first, she stayed silent, avoiding the other children as much as she could. She would sit alone, playing with the few toys that the orphanage had, small, worn-out dolls and blocks. She often found herself staring at the other children, wishing she could join them, but feeling like she didn't belong. One day, while the other children were outside playing, Sarah, one of the kindest caretakers at the orphanage, came to visit Emily. Sarah had noticed something special about the quiet little girl who spent most of her time alone. She had seen the way Emily would carefully pick up her toys and arrange them in strange patterns, the the way her eyes would light up whenever she made something new. It was in those moments Sarah could see a spark of something inside Emily, a hidden talent waiting to emerge. "Come on, sweet girl," Sarah said one afternoon, taking Emily by the hand and leading her to the art room. The room was small and smelled faintly of paint and clay, but to Emily, it felt like stepping into a world of possibility. There were paints, brushes, and colorful crayons everywhere, as well as blocks of clay waiting to be molded. Emily had never touched clay before. The idea of making something with her hands felt foreign and intimidating. But Sarah, with her patient smile, encouraged Emily to try. "You've got magic in those hands. I can see it," she said. "Give it a try. No one can tell you what you can or can't do." Reluctantly at first, Emily took a small block of clay and began to shape it. Her hands were stiff, and the clay felt oddly cold, but soon she felt the texture beneath her fingertips, and she began to mold it with more confidence. As the days passed, she began to shape things more easily. Little animals, abstract shapes, and eventually small figures that started to resemble people. It was through art that Emily began to express herself. As she grew, her skill with clay and paint flourished, and it became her refuge. Her differences no longer felt like something to hide. They became a part of her art, a part of who she was. She started to create sculptures of people, animals, and strange, fantastical creatures, each one unique and beautiful in its own way. Emily's artwork wasn't just about the shapes or colors. It was about the emotions and stories she could convey through her hands. Sarah saw Emily's progress and encouraged her every step of the way. She told her that she was special. She could make things no one else could, things that came from deep within her. "Don't let anyone tell you you're less than perfect," Sarah would say. "Your hands might be different, but they are capable of beautiful things." But it wasn't just Sarah's encouragement that kept Emily going. As Emily's skills grew, she began to see the world around her differently. She realized that the kids who had once teased her, who called her names and made her feel small, weren't so different from her. They, too, had their own struggles, their own weaknesses, their own insecurities. And just like her, they were searching for a way to feel seen, to feel valued. There were still moments when the loneliness crept back in, when the other children would turn their backs or laugh at her sculptures. Emily would retreat to her art, burying herself in her work to block out the harsh words. But each time, she returned stronger. Her art became her voice. It became her strength. At the age of 8, Emily received a new visitor. Her name was Zoe, and she had just arrived at the orphanage. Zoe was a bright-eyed girl, full of energy and excitement, and she instantly befriended the other children. But when she saw Emily for the first time, Zoe screamed and ran away, horrified by Emily's face and appearance. Emily was crushed. She ran to the bathroom, tears streaming down her face as she hid from the world. Sarah found her there, crouched in the corner, her face buried in her hands. Without a word, Sarah knelt beside her and enveloped Emily in a warm hug. "Sweetheart, remember what I always tell you," Sarah whispered. "Real beauty comes from the inside, and your heart, my dear, is more beautiful than anyone can see." After that day, something shifted in Emily. She made a promise to herself that no matter how others reacted to her, she would always be kind to every new child who came to the orphanage. She became the welcoming face, the one who would show the new kids around, give them a hug, and share her art with them. She learned that kindness was the key to unlocking the beauty of the world around her. Emily's strength grew with every day that passed. She found herself becoming braver, her self-worth no longer tied to the approval of others. Through her art, she learned that she didn't have to fit anyone else's expectations. She was perfect, just as she was. As the years passed, Emily's art became not just a form of personal expression, but her way of showing the world that beauty comes in all shapes, sizes, and forms. She had spent countless hours in the orphanage's small art room, shaping clay, painting, and pouring her heart into every creation. Each sculpture she crafted told a story. Each stroke of paint on canvas revealed a new layer of herself. Emily didn't just make art, she lived through it. The other children began to notice her work. What started as private creations for her own comfort slowly began to attract the attention of the caretakers and even some of the visitors who came to the orphanage. Sarah, who had supported Emily from the very beginning, often displayed her pieces around the orphanage, saying, "Look at these. Aren't they beautiful? They tell the story of a heart that can never be broken." Emily's sculptures ranged from abstract shapes to animals, to portraits of people she had met in her life. Each figure was unique and expressive, capturing a rawness and vulnerability that was hard to ignore. Her art wasn't about perfection, it was about telling the truth, even if that truth was painful. And people were drawn to it. It wasn't long before Emily's artwork caught the eye of someone important. One afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Sparkle, a renowned gallery owner from the big city, came to visit the orphanage. She had heard rumors of a young artist whose work was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Intrigued, she made a special trip to see for herself. Mrs. Sparkle was a tall woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, her silver hair styled elegantly in a bun. She had seen many art pieces over the years, but nothing quite like what Emily had created. Mrs. Sparkle was immediately captivated by Emily's work, the way the pieces seemed to tell stories of pain, healing, and hope all at once. "This is extraordinary," Mrs. Sparkle murmured to Sarah, her voice thick with awe. "Where did she learn to make such art? Who taught her?" Sarah, with a knowing smile, replied, "She taught herself." Emily is an artist with a rare gift, a gift that sees the beauty in imperfection. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Emily. Mrs. Sparkle approached her with an offer. She wanted to showcase Emily's work in a gallery exhibition in the city. "You have something special," Mrs. Sparkle said. "I believe the world needs to see your art. I want to give you a chance to show everyone what you've created." At first, Emily was hesitant. She had never shown her art to the world outside the orphanage. The thought of putting herself and her work out there for everyone to see made her nervous. What if people didn't understand her? What if they laughed at her? Just like the children had when she was younger. But Sarah, who had watched Emily grow, was there to remind her of the strength she had developed over the years. "You've already shown the world your courage, Emily," she said. "Your art is your voice, and it deserves to be heard. Don't hide your beauty from the world." Encouraged by Sarah's words, Emily agreed to the exhibition. It was a big step for her, one that pushed her out of her comfort zone, but she knew it was time to take the leap. The exhibition, which would be called The Beauty of Imperfection, was set to take place in one of the most prestigious galleries in the city. The day of the exhibition arrived, and Emily could hardly contain her excitement and nerves. She had never been to a gallery before, let alone had her own pieces displayed for the world to see. As she stepped into the grand space, she felt small, overwhelmed by the towering walls and the sophisticated crowd. This was a different world, a world she had never imagined she would be a part of. But as the evening went on, Emily began to realize something incredible. People were not just admiring her art, they were connecting with it. They saw her story in her sculptures. They saw her struggles and her triumphs in the shapes she had molded from clay. Every person who came by her pieces had something profound to say. One visitor, a young woman in a brightly colored dress, was so moved by Emily's work that she stood in front of one sculpture for over 20 minutes, tears in her eyes. This is exactly how I feel," she said, her voice breaking. "It's like you've captured my heart in this piece." Emily was in shock. She had never imagined that her art could affect people in such a deep way. She had always created for herself, for healing, for catharsis. But now, her work was helping others heal, too. As the night went on, the gallery was filled with praise for Emily's talent. Critics wrote glowing reviews, calling her a prodigy of raw emotion and an artist who redefined the concept of beauty. Word of her exhibition spread quickly, and soon, people from all over the city were flocking to see her work. That night, as Emily stood next to her art, she couldn't help but smile. The little girl who had once been abandoned, ridiculed, and ignored had found a way to share her story with the world. And in doing so, she had helped others feel seen and heard. But the biggest surprise of the night came when a woman named Jasmine, a well-known fashion model agent, approached Emily with a proposal. Jasmine, who had been watching the exhibition, was struck by the way Emily carried herself. She could see something in her that went beyond her art, a unique beauty that transcended the superficial. "You're extraordinary," Jasmine said, her eyes sparkling. "We're looking for models who stand out, who don't fit the usual mold. You have a look that is perfect for our agency. We'd love to work with you." Emily's jaw dropped. A model? It seemed like an impossible thought, something beyond her wildest dreams. But then she remembered Sarah's words. "You've got magic in those hands." Thus, perhaps this was another opportunity to show the world that different was beautiful. After some thought, Emily agreed to give modeling a try. Her first photo shoot was a whirlwind, but she quickly found herself enjoying it. She wasn't just posing in front of a camera, she was telling a story. Each photo was a reflection of her inner strength, her journey, and the beauty of embracing who she truly was. Soon, Emily's face appeared in magazines, her story inspiring millions. She had become not just an artist, but a symbol of empowerment, a reminder that beauty comes from within, and it's those who embrace their imperfections who truly shine. Emily's life had changed in ways she had never imagined. After her art exhibition, her name was being whispered in every corner of the art world. But what truly blew her away was the unexpected opportunity to enter the world of modeling. When Jasmine, the top model agent, approached her at the gallery, she felt as though a new door had opened that she hadn't even known existed. It was the kind of offer people only dreamt about. Her chance to model for one of the most prestigious agencies in the world. How could she say no? At first, Emily hesitated. She had spent so many years hiding herself away, focused on her art and keeping a low profile, that the thought of being in front of cameras, under the spotlight, made her feel exposed. Would she be able to handle the intense scrutiny? Would people judge her for what she looked like, just like when she was a child? But as Jasmine spoke to her about the importance of embracing uniqueness and defying the stereotypical beauty standards, Emily began to see the potential. "Look at you," Jasmine had said, with a look of admiration. "You're different, and that's exactly why we want you. The world needs people who stand out, who redefine what beauty means. You have something that no one else has. Embrace it." With those words, Emily found the courage to step into the world of fashion modeling. She started out slowly, doing small photo shoots, but each time, she felt herself growing more confident. The photographers loved her raw, unfiltered beauty, the way her scars and imperfections told a story of survival and resilience. Emily wasn't just another pretty face. She was a symbol of strength, a reminder that beauty could come from places no one had expected. Soon, Emily began working with major brands. Her photo shoots became more frequent. Her portfolio grew, and her face began appearing in fashion magazines across the globe. She was featured in ads for high-end clothing lines, showcasing her ability to wear the most extravagant outfits with grace. The world was beginning to see her not for her flaws, but for the depth of her character and the power of her individuality. However, no matter how successful she became, there was one thing that still haunted her: Tina. Tina was Emily's adopted sister, and although they had been raised in the same orphanage, they hadn't had much contact in their adult lives. Tina had been taken in by a wealthy family after being abandoned, and as Emily rose to fame, she began to notice Tina's name appearing in headlines too. Tina had been successful in her own right, working as a well-known model and socialite, often gracing the pages of magazines with her perfectly curated life. She was beautiful, tall, and had the polished appearance that everyone seemed to crave. But there was something about Tina's success that felt uncomfortable to Emily. She knew Tina had never truly understood the pain of being abandoned, of being the child who was cast aside. Tina's life had been the one Emily's biological parents had dreamed of for her. a life of luxury and privilege. Emily had struggled and fought for every inch of success, while Tina had been handed everything on a silver platter. The first time Emily saw Tina at a major fashion event, she felt an immediate wave of tension wash over her. Tina, with her perfect face and flawless body, was the darling of the fashion world. She glided through the crowd with a confidence that seemed to come naturally, her eyes scanning the room with an air of superiority. Emily, on the other hand, stood in the corner, awkward and unsure, as the cameras flashed around her. It was hard to ignore the contrast between them. Tina, the adopted daughter of a wealthy family, and Emily, the girl who had been abandoned and raised in a children's home. But as much as Emily tried to push away the jealousy that gnawed at her, she couldn't help but wonder, did Tina ever think about her? Did she even know the truth about their past? As fate would have it, Emily was invited to a high-profile charity gala where she would be working alongside Tina. The two models would be featured in a campaign to raise awareness for children's rights and support orphanages around the world. It was a powerful cause, and Emily felt a deep connection to it. She was excited to contribute to something so meaningful, but the thought of sharing the spotlight with Tina made her stomach turn. On the night of the gala, the atmosphere was electric. The event was held at a lavish ballroom, with towering chandeliers casting a golden glow over the crowd. Emily walked the red carpet, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was her time to shine. But there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling of being overshadowed by Tina's presence. As they were introduced backstage, Emily tried to keep her composure, but Tina, who had been surrounded by photographers and adoring fans all evening, seemed to notice her for the first time. Her expression softened for a moment, and she gave Emily a tentative smile. "Emily, it's been a long time," Tina said, her voice hesitant, as though unsure of how to approach her. "How are you?" "It's so good to see you again." Emily stared at Tina for a moment, surprised by the warmth in her voice. It wasn't the cold, distant Tina she had remembered. Something had changed. Maybe she was trying to connect, Emily thought, but the tension remained, hanging between them like an invisible wall. Emily couldn't quite bring herself to believe Tina's sudden kindness. The years of feeling like she had been left behind weren't easily forgotten. "I'm fine," Emily replied, her voice steady but guarded. "It's good to see you too." Tina seemed to sense the distance, and for a moment, the smile faltered. "I know things have been complicated," she said. "I've always wondered why you didn't come find me after the orphanage. I mean, we could have been a family, right? I'm sorry for everything that happened. I didn't know." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected Tina to bring up the past. Her mind raced with emotions. Why did you never reach out? Why did you never try to understand me? But instead of speaking her mind, Emily took a deep breath and simply said, "It's complicated, but I found my way. I don't need anyone else to define me anymore." The conversation ended there, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them. For the first time, she wondered if Tina's life, so different from hers, wasn't as perfect as it seemed. As the night went on, Emily began to realize something profound. Her journey wasn't about proving anything to Tina or anyone else. It was about proving to herself that she could be whole and complete on her own. The world didn't need to define her, and neither did Tina. That night, Emily found herself standing tall and proud in front of the flashing cameras. She wasn't just a model. She wasn't just an artist. She was a woman who had fought for every inch of her life, and that was her true beauty. Emily had quickly established herself as a rising star in the fashion world. Her unique look, marked by imperfections that others considered flaws, had become her signature. Every campaign she graced, every photo shoot she participated in, was met with critical acclaim. Designers loved her. Fashion photographers adored her. She was different, and the world was beginning to take notice. But with that success came challenges, particularly in the form of Tina, the beautiful, accomplished model who had already been a household name for years. Tina had everything that Emily didn't, at least it appeared that way. She was the epitome of the fashion industry's conventional idea of beauty. Tall, slender, flawless skin, and a picture-perfect face. She had graced the covers of countless magazines, walked in prestigious fashion shows, and built a reputation as one of the most sought-after models in the business. Emily's rise in the industry had not gone unnoticed by Tina. They had briefly crossed paths during a few events, but the tension between them was undeniable. Emily had always tried to stay focused on her work, but Tina's presence in the industry was hard to ignore, and it didn't help that Tina's own success seemed to overshadow Emily's in ways that left Emily feeling both inadequate and fueled by determination. Their first real encounter was at a major fashion gala, an exclusive event that brought together the biggest names in the industry. Emily had been invited as the guest of honor, a recognition of her growing influence in the fashion world. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of diversity in fashion, and Emily was thrilled to be a part of it. But as soon as she entered the grand ballroom, her excitement turned to dread. There, standing in the center of the room, was Tina, glowing with an aura of confidence that radiated from every inch of her. She was laughing with other models, surrounded by photographers who couldn't get enough of her. Her flawless smile and perfect posture were exactly what the fashion world adored. As soon as Tina saw Emily walking in, her eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Emily could feel the weight of Tina's gaze. It was cold, calculated, and it made Emily feel smaller than she had ever felt in her entire career. Emily's heart raced. Why does she look at me like that? Why does it always feel like she's looking down on me? But Emily refused to show any weakness. She had worked too hard to let anyone, especially Tina, get under her skin. She walked confidently across the room, greeting the other guests with a smile. But her eyes never met Tina's. She could feel the tension thickening in the air. It wasn't long before their paths crossed again, this time at the runway rehearsal for the gala's fashion show. Tina was already in position, practicing her runway walk. Her movements were fluid, practiced, and effortless, everything the fashion world loved. Emily, on the other hand, had been asked to walk for the first time in a high-profile runway show. She was nervous, but she had trained herself to stay calm and poised in front of the camera. She didn't let her doubts control her, especially not in a moment like this. But Tina's presence was hard to ignore. As Emily began her walk down the runway for the rehearsal, she could feel Tina's eyes following her every move. Tina's gaze was sharp, almost calculating, as if she were trying to find some fault in Emily's performance. Emily could hear the soft whispers from other models as they watched her walk. She couldn't tell if they were impressed or mocking her, but she refused to let the nerves take over. The moment Emily reached the end of the runway, she heard a voice from behind her, sharp and pointed. "You're not supposed to walk like that," Tina said, her tone condescending. "You're supposed to own the runway. Like this," she added, demonstrating with exaggerated movements. "You'll never make it if you don't master the basics." Emily's chest tightened. Tina's words stung, but Emily refused to show it. She smiled thinly and took a deep breath. "You won't get to me this time, Tina. I've come too far. I'll be fine," Emily replied, her voice steady, despite the anger bubbling up inside her. "I'm not trying to be like you, Tina. I'm trying to be myself." Tina's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We'll see how far that gets you." The tension between them was palpable, but Emily didn't let it derail her. She finished the rehearsal with confidence, determined not to let Tina's words dictate her path. That night, as the gala began, the models lined up backstage, preparing for their grand entrance. Emily could hear the chatter around her, the excitement building as they prepared to walk the runway, but Tina's presence loomed over her like a dark cloud. The show began, and the lights went down. The audience fell silent as the first model made her way down the runway. Emily stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done countless photo shoots, but this was different. This was live. The eyes of the entire industry were on her. As Emily began her walk, she let everything go. She focused on her breath, on the rhythm of her movements, and most importantly, on herself. She didn't try to mimic Tina's flawless grace. She didn't try to be anyone else, but the version of herself that had fought to get to this moment. And it worked. As Emily made her way down the runway, she felt the energy shift. The crowd, which had been silent at first, began to whisper excitedly. She could hear murmurs of approval and admiration from the front row. It wasn't the perfect, polished walk that Tina had demonstrated, but there was something raw, something real about Emily's presence on stage. She was magnetic, not because of her physical beauty, but because of the strength and confidence she exuded. Emily had embraced her imperfections and transformed them into something beautiful. When the show ended, Emily found herself surrounded by photographers, designers, and industry insiders. They were all eager to talk to her, eager to hear her story. And for the first time, Emily felt like she belonged. She had earned her place in this world, not by imitating others, but by embracing who she truly was. Tina, on the other hand, stood off to the side, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She had watched Emily's walk from backstage, and though she didn't show it, a small seed of doubt had been planted. Emily had done something that Tina had never thought possible. She had made the runway her own. Later that evening, as the gala wound down, Emily found herself alone in a quiet corner, trying to process everything that had happened. Her mind was racing, and her heart was still pounding from the excitement. She was proud of herself, proud of how far she had come. But then, as she took a deep breath, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Tina. "I didn't think you had it in you," Tina said, her voice softer than it had been earlier. "But I guess you proved me wrong. You're not like everyone else. Maybe there's something to your different approach after all." Emily looked at Tina, surprised by the sincerity in her words. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not trying to compete with you, Tina. I'm just trying to do my own thing." Tina nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I get it. I guess I've been a little jealous." Emily smiled back, feeling a small sense of relief. The tension between them hadn't disappeared, but in that moment, they understood each other a little better. They were both part of the same industry, but they were traveling very different paths. And perhaps, in that brief exchange, they had finally started to find some common ground. Emily's success in the modeling world had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had gone from the abandoned child left at an orphanage to a celebrated artist and sought-after model, admired for her unique beauty and resilience. But no matter how far she had come, there was one question that still lingered in the back of her mind. Who was she? Really? She had built a life for herself, one filled with people who loved and supported her, but a part of her always wondered about her true origins. The pain of being abandoned had haunted her for as long as she could remember, and despite her achievements, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, someone. The question of who her biological parents were had lingered like a shadow over her, casting a quiet unease over her every triumph. It wasn't until one fateful evening that Emily's curiosity finally got the better of her. After a particularly intense modeling campaign, during which she had become the face of a major luxury brand, Emily found herself at a crossroads. The glamour of her success had begun to wear off, and in the quiet moments, she could no longer ignore the gnawing question of her past. Despite the fame, despite the love from her friends, and despite the life she had carved out for herself, a piece of her heart remained empty. One evening, as Emily was going through old boxes of mementos from her childhood, she stumbled upon an old, crumpled letter. It had been hidden deep within a stack of papers she had nearly forgotten about. It was the note her adoptive parents, the ones who had raised her after her abandonment, had kept all these years. The note had been written by the caretakers of the orphanage where she had been left as a baby. It was a copy of the original letter left by her biological parents when they had abandoned her. The letter was short, barely a few lines, but the words hit Emily like a ton of bricks. "We can't take care of her. Please find her a good home." Those words had been written by her real parents, Victoria and Robert, the same Victoria and Robert who had abandoned her at the orphanage all those years ago. Emily felt the world around her tilt as the realization hit her. The parents she had spent her whole life wondering about were not strangers. They were not faceless people lost to the winds of time. They were her biological parents. The same parents who had left her behind, who had made the decision that she wasn't good enough for their perfect life. A flood of emotions surged through Emily. Hurt, anger, disbelief. It all came rushing in, overwhelming her. How could they have done this to her? How could they have just left her without a second thought? With nothing more than a brief note that was barely a sentence long, Emily knew she had to get to the bottom of this. She had to know the full truth, why they had done this, and why they had never tried to find her again. That night, she couldn't sleep. The pain in her chest was unbearable. She knew that the only way she could truly move forward was to face this truth head-on. She couldn't keep running away from the past, and she certainly couldn't let it control her anymore. Emily made a decision. She would track down her biological parents, confront them, and finally get the answers she had spent her whole life searching for. She reached out to a private investigator named Jack Sloan, who specialized in cold cases. Jack was known for his dogged determination and skill in uncovering long-buried truths. She explained her situation to him, the story of her abandonment, her life in the orphanage, and the strange emptiness that had haunted her all these years. Jack listened intently, then agreed to take on the case. He promised Emily he would find her parents, no matter what it took. Days turned into weeks as Jack dug into records, following leads that seemed to go nowhere. Emily tried to stay patient, but with each passing day, the questions in her mind grew louder. What would she say to them? What if they were ashamed of her? What if they didn't even care to meet her after all these years? Then, one morning, Jack called her with some news. His voice was steady, but there was an urgency in it that made Emily's heart skip a beat. "I've found something," he said. "I've traced your biological parents. They're living in a suburban neighborhood about 2 towns over. Their names are Victoria and Robert Thompson." The words hit Emily like a thunderclap. Victoria and Robert. Her mind raced as she processed the information. These were the same names she had known her whole life. They were her biological parents, the ones who had abandoned her so long ago. Jack gave her the address. "I know this is a lot to take in, but I think you're ready for this," he said. "You need to decide what you want to do next." Emily was silent for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. She had spent so many years dreaming about meeting them, but now that the opportunity was here, she didn't know what to feel. Anger? Sadness? Or maybe something else entirely, something she couldn't even name. After a long pause, Emily finally spoke. "I need to meet them. I need to know why they did this, why they abandoned me." Jack arranged everything for her. The next day, Emily found herself standing outside a modest suburban home, the address Jack had given her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, staring at the house. It was a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. There were no signs of wealth or grandeur, just ordinary homes with neat lawns and quiet streets. Emily took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. Her hands were clammy, her mind spinning with thoughts of what she might find behind the door. When it opened, she was face to face with a woman who looked strangely familiar. Victoria, the woman who had abandoned her so many years ago. Victoria's face fell as she recognized Emily. Her eyes widened with shock, and her mouth went dry. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The years between them stretched out like an ocean, impossible to cross. Emily," Victoria stammered, her voice shaking. "I can't believe it's really you." "I can't believe it either," Emily replied coldly. "Why didn't you ever come back for me? Why did you leave me at the orphanage?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she stepped back, motioning for Emily to come inside. "Please, come in. We need to talk." As Emily stepped inside, she saw Robert sitting in the living room. He too was visibly shaken. The two of them, her biological parents, looked older now, their faces drawn with guilt and regret. But none of that mattered to Emily. The pain from all those years of abandonment surged within her, and she didn't know if she could ever forgive them. "I don't know how to begin," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were young, scared, and didn't know what to do. I couldn't handle the pressure. We thought we were doing the right thing. We thought you would have a better life without us." Emily's eyes blazed with anger. "Better life? By leaving me? By abandoning me like I was nothing?" Robert stood up, his face etched with regret. "We were wrong, Emily. We know that now. We've regretted it every single day. We tried to find you, but we didn't know where to look. And every time we thought about you, the guilt was too much to bear." Emily stood silent, her heart torn between the anger she felt and the hurt she had carried for years. She had always wondered why they left her behind, but hearing their confession didn't make it any easier. "I've built my life without you," Emily said, her voice steadier now. "I've made myself into something, even though you weren't there. I didn't need you to make me who I am." Victoria broke down in tears. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to abandon you." Emily took a deep breath, trying to find her words. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I came here for answers, and now I have them." She stood up, her heart heavy, but her resolve stronger than ever. Emily had faced her past and confronted the people who had left her behind. But in doing so, she had finally realized that her worth was never defined by them, nor by anyone else. It was something she had created on her own. The days following her confrontation with her biological parents, Victoria and Robert, were filled with a mixture of emotions that Emily struggled to process. For the first time in her life, she had learned the truth about why she had been abandoned. But learning the truth didn't come with the satisfaction she had imagined. The words of her parents, their apologies, their tears, only deepened the complex emotions within her. She had spent years thinking about them, wondering why they had left her behind, and now that she had the answers, it felt as though the hole in her heart had only grown larger. In the weeks after the meeting, Emily took some time away from her busy career. She didn't want to deal with the flashbulbs of cameras or the artificial world of fashion. She needed to find herself again alone, away from the noise and the expectations that surrounded her. She retreated to a small cabin by the lake, a place she had always found peace in, even as a child. There, with the quiet waters and the whisper of the trees, Emily began to reflect on everything that had happened. The modeling career, the art, the pain, the abandonment. It all swirled together, like the colors in one of her sculptures, constantly shifting and changing, but never settling. She spent her days walking by the water, thinking about what had happened, what was said. Her parents had apologized. Yes, but something about it felt hollow. They claimed they had tried to find her, that they regretted what they had done. But Emily could never truly understand what it was like to be them. She couldn't fathom how they had made such a drastic decision. She had spent years imagining the perfect reunion, the heartfelt apology, the sense of closure. But when it came, it wasn't perfect at all. It was messy, imperfect, just like everything else in her life. And yet, something about that imperfection made her realize that she had built a life on her own. She didn't need the validation of her biological parents to prove her worth. She had already proven it to herself. She had survived, she had thrived, and she had done it without them. Her success in the fashion world, her rise as an artist, and the love she had found within herself and from others was enough. But it was still painful. There were nights when she woke up in tears, feeling like an abandoned child once more. And there were moments when she thought about what could have been, the life she could have had with her biological parents if they had chosen differently. She thought about the family she might have had, the love and support she might have received if things had gone another way. But then she would remind herself of the truth. She didn't need them to be happy. One evening, as she sat on the dock, watching the sunset reflect off the lake's surface, Emily took out a small notebook she had kept throughout her life. It was a journal she had started when she was young, her place for her to pour out her thoughts when no one else was around. She flipped through the pages filled with longing, sorrow, anger, and confusion. But as she read, she saw something else too. There were pages filled with hope. There were drawings of the future she dreamed of. There were aspirations to be more than what others saw in her, to rise above her past and define her own future. And in that moment, Emily realized that everything she had become, everything she was the result of her own strength. She had built her life from the ground up, piece by piece. And although she was still carrying the weight of her past, it was no longer controlling her. It no longer defined who she was. She had learned to embrace her differences, to find beauty in the things that made her unique. She had found peace in her art, in her modeling, and in the simple act of being herself. Emily had found a way to heal, not through the approval of others, but by accepting herself fully. She had learned that self-worth didn't come from external validation, it came from within. With a deep breath, Emily closed the journal and tucked it back into her bag. The time had come for her to move on, to embrace the future with open arms. The past was behind her now, and while it would always be a part of her, it would no longer define her. She was no longer the abandoned child from the orphanage. She was no longer the girl searching for approval. She was Emily, the artist, the model, the woman who had built herself from the inside out. The next day, Emily returned to the city, to the fashion world that had embraced her as its own. She had a new sense of clarity, a new understanding of herself. She was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone, least of all her biological parents. She had nothing to prove. She had already done that. Her first runway show back was different from all the others. This time, when Emily walked down the catwalk, she did so with a sense of pride and confidence that was impossible to ignore. She no longer cared about being perfect in the eyes of others. She didn't need to be. Her beauty was her own, and it was more than just skin deep. As the lights flashed and the photographers snapped their pictures, Emily smiled, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was truly free. Over the next few months, Emily continued to rise in her career, but she also began to take on new projects that spoke to her heart. She used her platform to support causes that mattered to her, advocating for orphaned children, raising awareness about the importance of self-love, and teaching young girls that beauty is not just about appearance, but about strength, character, and authenticity. And slowly, her relationship with her biological parents began to evolve. Victoria and Robert reached out again, this time with no expectations, just an honest desire to make amends. Emily didn't know what the future held for their relationship, but she knew that she had already forgiven them in her heart. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing their actions. It was about freeing herself from the weight of resentment. She didn't need them to heal, and she didn't need them to define who she was. But maybe, just maybe, they could become a part of her life again. She would take it one day at a time, without rushing, without forcing anything. As Emily stood on the stage at a charity event she was hosting for orphaned children, she looked out at the crowd and smiled. This was where she was meant to be, helping others, using her voice and her platform to make a difference. She wasn't perfect. She had her scars, both physical and emotional. But those scars were part of her story, part of what made her whole. And as she spoke to the crowd about the importance of believing in oneself and embracing one's uniqueness, Emily knew that her journey was far from over. She had found peace with her past, and with her parents, and with herself. And now, it was time to move forward, stronger than ever, with the knowledge that she was enough just as she was. As Emily continued her journey of self-discovery and healing, life began to take on a new rhythm. No longer consumed by the questions of her past, she embraced her future with open arms, knowing that her worth was not defined by the circumstances of her birth or the people who had once abandoned her. Her career as a model had blossomed, but now it wasn't just about walking the runway or gracing magazine covers. It was about making a difference. Emily became a powerful voice for change, using her platform to advocate for those who felt unseen, just as she had once felt. Her passion for helping orphaned children grew stronger, and she began to partner with organizations that provided support and education for kids without families. Emily was determined to give back in ways she had never imagined possible. Every photo shoot, every runway show, and every event she participated in was an opportunity to amplify her message. Embrace your imperfections, and never let anyone tell you that you are less than beautiful. The model who once struggled to accept her own reflection in the mirror had become a beacon of hope for millions. Emily showed the world that true beauty came from within, and that it was okay to be different. But as her career soared to new heights, Emily realized that her work wasn't finished. There was still so much more to do, so many people to help, and so much more of herself to discover. She knew that she could continue to grow, that she could be a catalyst for change and a voice for those who needed it most. And with that realization, Emily committed herself to one final goal: to build her own foundation for orphaned children, a safe space where kids could learn, grow, and ultimately find their own voices. As she stood in front of her foundation's opening ceremony, surrounded by children whose lives she had touched, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had come a long way from the abandoned child left at the gates of an orphanage. She had worked hard to create a life of purpose, one where her passion for helping others was just as important as her personal success. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who believed in her and the children whose futures she had shaped, Emily realized that her life had become exactly what she had always dreamed of: a life filled with love, acceptance, and purpose. She turned to the crowd, ready to give her speech. As she looked out at the faces before her, she smiled, a heart full of gratitude. She no longer felt lost or abandoned. She had found her place in the world, and she had built it on her own terms. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady and full of emotion. "This foundation represents everything I've learned in my life: the importance of finding your voice, embracing your uniqueness, and knowing that no matter where you come from, you have the power to create the future you deserve." She paused, looking around at the crowd, the children, the supporters, and the friends who had stood by her through it all. We're all different, and that's what makes us special. Our scars, physical or emotional, are what make us who we are. They don't define us, they give us strength. As she finished her speech, the crowd erupted in applause. For Emily, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the knowledge that she had done what she set out to do. She had given others the courage to live their truth and to embrace their differences. This was her true victory. Emily's story has come full circle, but it doesn't end here. Her journey is a powerful reminder that the past doesn't define us, and the future is ours to create. If you've been inspired by Emily's journey, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on her story and many others like hers. And now, I'd love to hear from you. What makes you feel empowered to embrace your own uniqueness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation and inspire each other.